Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar with Austin Unruh. We're thrilled to have you join us for this discussion on how integrating trees into pasture systems can enhance productivity, resilience, and long-term farm profitability. I'm Taylor Henry from Acres USA, and I'll be your host for today's session. Today's session is being recorded and will be available. Our speaker today is Austin Unruh, the founder of Trees for Graziers, the largest silvopasture-focused company in the U.S. Over the past 5 years, Austin has worked extensively with farmers and graziers to establish tree systems that not only support livestock operations, but also improve soil health, enhance biodiversity, and create more resilient farms. Today's presentation is an overview from a full-day workshop that Austin did in December at our 49th annual EcoAg conference, and there will be Q&A at the end of it. You can get Austin's recordings. There'll be a link in the description, and use code TREES for the number 4 Graziers for 50% off Austin's presentation and the general session EcoAg recordings. Since early 2023, Acres USA has collaborated with OCIA through the support of the USDA Transition to Organic program, TOPP. We are thrilled to continue our partnership this year. Our joint efforts with OCIA encompass creating a range of white papers, webinars, and podcasts aimed at educating producers on various facets of transitioning to organic farming. Additionally, we provide on-farm events that offer local producers the opportunity to gain insights from pioneers and early adopters within their communities. Without further ado, let's dive in, and please join me in welcoming Austin Unruh.
For Graziers. There we go. Let's see if I can advance my slide right here. I was able to earlier. Here, I think. There we got it. Okay, so we at Trees for Graziers, our goal is to take grazing to new heights. So really to use the strong foundation that is grass-based livestock operations. So running on perennial grass-based grazing operations, and using trees to take those farms to the next level. So our goal is to make this as simple as possible for farmers to do, because we recognize that farmers tend to be very, very busy. They don't have a whole lot of time, money, or energy to put into something that isn't going to give them any kind of yield for several years down the road. So what we do is we provide all of the services that are needed in order to do a project. And that's given us a very valuable insight into all of the different parts of a silvopasture project. So we have consultants, so we have a whole team that's dedicated to consulting and plan writing and doing the project management for projects. We can also help folks find the funding that they need in order to establish trees in their pastures, because we found that uh, most farmers aren't sitting on a whole bunch of cash that they can invest in something that isn't going to return them for a number of years. So accessing funding is very, very useful for reducing that cost of investing in a silvopasture. We also have a silvo-specific nursery where we are growing the right genetics and the right stock, the right size for these projects. And in the last couple of years, we've mainly been able to grow for our own projects. And now we're starting to have enough that we can sell outside of our own projects as well. We have a crew that does planting, and then we take care of the trees after they've been planted. So it's really nice that we get to see these trees and how they're doing for years, like twice a year, for the first 4, 5, 6 years after they've been planted. We get that feedback, and we're seeing if there's an issue in one side of what we're doing, whether it's our nursery stock or if it's our plans, our consulting process. We can make changes to it, and then we can adjust the whole system. And it's really given us a lot of insight into how these systems work and how they best can be implemented. And we have a lot of resources available on our website, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. So most of what we focus on at Trees for Grazers is planting trees into open pastures. We really don't get into thinning silvopasture very much. Most of that is because the context that we are in is an area where land is really expensive. Land has been farmed for the last 300 years, and there's very few trees remaining. There's very few scrubby areas, so it's mostly open pastures or open fields, and now we're looking to reintroduce trees into those. So that's our focus, is planting trees into pastures. Our focus is also on doing silvopasture that's there specifically for the livestock. When we work with folks, we tell them that there's generally two paths that they can go down. You can go down both, you can do both of these things, but generally folks pick kind of one or the other. So you can add new human crop enterprises, food enterprises that could be chestnuts, that could be pawpaws, it can be apples for cider, hazelnuts, whatever you want to do. Timber would kind of also fall in that. It's a new enterprise that you can get into, a new income stream for the farm. The other path is to add trees that are there to support your livestock enterprises. That could be your existing livestock enterprises, or maybe you want to add some more as well in the future. But these trees are there specifically to support livestock. And that's what we focus on. For most of our clients, most of our grazing clients are grazers first and foremost, and they want to continue to be grazers. They don't necessarily want to be chestnut farmers and figure out how to grow and harvest and then process and then market those. They already have an outlet for their beef or their milk or whatever it is that they're growing. And to get into a new market, one that is young, that will require a lot of education of folks. The investment in the infrastructure to manage all this stuff is a fairly significant jump. So for most people, it's easiest to just focus on those livestock enterprises and then plant trees like chestnuts and apples and whatnot for their own homestead. And that's a great option for anyone because that gives them more self-sufficiency in their own food, their own diets for their home. But really, mostly we focus on silvopasture for livestock because that can scale to millions and millions and millions of acres without any problem. There's no market glut that we're going to get if we scale that kind of silvopasture to tens of millions of acres. When we talk about tree selection, and we're only going to get into a little bit of tree selection because we don't have that much time today. These are some slides that from a presentation that I gave at Acres. I think it was 6.5 hours. There's a lot of content that you can go through to really get into the nitty-gritty detail about these things. And I would recommend that folks, if you really want to get into this, go and watch that presentation because it gives a lot more detail. So today I'm just going to go over some basics. When it comes to species selection, we tend to think of a couple different categories. So one is our fast-growing shade trees, and those trees, they might only be there for 10, 20 years before we thin them out. So that's going to be like our hybrid poplars and our hybrid willows especially are going to be short-term trees. Our black locust and our sycamore also fall into that category of fast-growing trees, but they will last longer. They'll last 60 years, 100 years or more, especially for your sycamores. And they can be our long-term shade trees. And oftentimes what we've done in the last couple of years is we've alternated between a fast-growing shade tree, especially one that we don't plan on having around for very long, and slower growing trees that are going to be there for much longer, like a honey locust or a persimmon or an oak that is going to take longer to get to maturity. So we want other trees there that are going to provide shade while those slower growing trees are getting up to that size. When we're talking about ruminants, honey locust is kind of your number one tree. It has the most applicability for ruminant silvopasture. Persimmons is up there as well. Apples and pears are also interesting to take a look at, especially further north where honey locusts and persimmons are not quite cold hardy enough, or where it starts to stretch their abilities. For pigs and poultry, and we were talking about this a little bit in the introduction before we got started, is that poultry in particular, they can eat mulberries and persimmons. Those are two really good options. And mulberry is kind of your number one when it comes to both pigs and poultry. And then pigs can eat just a whole lot more variety of tree crops. So your oaks, your chestnuts, your hazelnuts, apples, pears, and more can all be consumed by pigs as well. And one of the things that we're really looking forward to is pushing forward what we can do for monogastrics. So, animals that only have one stomach. So, your pigs and your poultry, your chickens, your geese, your turkeys, all of those, is how much can we get off of bought feed, so grains, and how much can we grow on the farm instead? That's almost no one's doing it. I'd love to find examples of people doing it here in the United States. They used to, and I think there's a lot of upside if we can move more that direction again. And then lastly, the last category for us is kind of a general, what we'll call a legacy trees or native trees. These are species that don't give as strong of an economic return as maybe a honey locust or a mulberry tree, but they're beautiful trees. They bring valuable ecosystem services, and they're great to have on the landscape. They might be on a smaller, you might use a smaller number of them, but they're great legacy trees to have around. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to get into some detail on honey locust in particular as an example of why we focus on this one and also why genetics are important and the nursery side of things is so important. Um, so I talk a lot about honey locust. It's one that we are working hard on to get the right genetics out there. But it's by no means the only tree that does well in a silvopasture setting. It's probably just the tree that has the highest upside for the most acres, especially for ruminants. One of the reasons there is that it will drop its pods during a time of year that's pretty ideal. So November, December, January, and those pods stay in good condition on the ground as well. So and that's important because if you have, let's say, an apple drops and an apple drops in September or so, and you're rotationally grazing and you don't get around there for 30, 40 days, the apple is gone. Whereas a honey locust pod, if it drops, especially if it drops, it's dropping during the winter, and it's consistently cold, and that pod is going to degrade much slower than an apple or a persimmon. So that's one of the really big upsides to honey locusts. They also have a nice dappled canopy, and they can fix some nitrogen as well. So our goal with honey locust is to have completely thornless trees that are all female, and only females are going to yield pods. We want them to yield consistently and a lot of pods, and we want them to be of high sugar varieties. Each one of those is important, and it takes some sourcing and some tree exploring to find the right stuff, and then to get it up to propagate enough of them is the other trick. So a lot of what we do is based on or is inspired by work from J. Russell Smith. J. Russell Smith wrote the book Tree Crops back in the 1920s. And this is a quote from his book saying that the trees grow in a Bermuda pasture that's always loaded in the fall with luscious fruit. The cows and hogs stand under it, always ready to devour every pod that falls. The tree is very large and beautiful. The cows improve in milk and the hogs in weight when the locust ripens, for there are always bushels and bushels on the tree. And it's these kind of into this, knowing that this is something that's kind of been lost to our culture, where we don't have a great tradition of tree crops anymore. We're working to bring that back. So this is a map of where honey locust can be found. This was available online. I did not create this. If I made it, there would be other examples outside of this light green area. So I've been sent pods from north of the Twin Cities in Minnesota. I've seen honey locust trees doing very well in Colorado, like in Denver. I've read reports of whole honey locust groves doing well in Colorado Springs. So that's a very dry area. And trees doing well in North Dakota and far northern parts of upstate New York. I think this map is underrepresenting, even as big as the area is that it shows, it's underrepresenting the area that honey locust can thrive in. Now, many people will raise the objection that honey locusts are nasty, thorny trees that have no place to be planted, and I can sympathize with that because a thorny honey locust tree is absolutely a nasty thing, and you don't want to deal with it, as these pictures show. You don't want those kind of trees coming into a pasture, and that's why genetics is and getting thornless trees, genuinely thornless trees is absolutely critical when it comes to honey locust. And that's why we've put a good bit of effort over the last number of years into getting the right trees. What we've done is we've sent seed from high quality nurseries, so or trees that we have selected from that were female, that were high, that were bearing a lot of pods and high sugar pods. We took seed from those and we sent them into nurseries. They sent us back thousands and thousands of seedlings, and then we planted those out. And we culled really, really hard for thorns. So anything that had thorns got yanked and got burned. And this spring, we sent out our first batch of trees from that project. Those were all thornless trees from high quality progeny. Now, we don't know of those ones which ones are male and which ones are female. You can't quite tell at this stage. But as they go out to projects and then they get planted and then we'll be able to monitor them and see which of those end up being female high quality trees that are completely thornless. So it's a long-term, let's say, mass selection process that we're doing here, all really to get the highest quality trees and then to propagate from them. Um, One thing to be just thoughtful of, and here's just a little nuance that is useful to keep in mind with trees. So for honey locust, you can obtain a thornless honey locust from a really, really thorny tree. So, like one of those trees in the picture, you could go up above the height where it stops producing thorns. Every tree has they kind of stop producing thorns at a certain point. And if you go high enough, let's say 15, 20 feet tall on the tree, you can take scion wood from that for propagation, for grafting. And if you graft that, um, you can create a completely thornless tree out of that. But the progeny of that tree have the genetics in them for thorniness. So it's something that we want to be thoughtful of in that we want to put out trees that are thorny, that show, or sorry, that are thornless, that don't show any thorns on them. But we also want to be thoughtful that the progeny of what we put out is also going to be thornless. So these are all things that we take into consideration when it comes to the propagation of these trees. Um, Also, if you're buying thornless trees, thornless honey locust trees, uh, be knowledgeable, be aware that those trees, when they're 12 inches tall and are thornless, they might well develop thorns as they get larger. We've learned this the hard way in years past, where we've planted a whole bunch of trees that were completely thornless when they were small, and that over time that they did develop more thorns. So again, that's why we did this whole mass selection process and did the really, really strong culling to get rid of those thorns and to get a much smaller batch of trees that were higher confidence, that we have a higher confidence in that those will continue to be thornless. So on these pods, so this just gives you an example of what pods can look like. The top one is a wild type pod. So they have about 17% sugar from our testing. And all the way on the bottom, this is a nice selected cultivar. I think it came out to be about 35% sugar. And if you were to break that pod in half, you can squeeze the sugar out, kind of like a jelly. Absolutely fantastic. Tastes good for us and to livestock as well. So when it comes to acquiring honey locust, Here's some of the categories that you could buy. So you can buy just generic seedlings, and I wouldn't recommend it. Um, we did it for a while because that's all that we had access to, and then we figured we would just graft onto those. At this point, I tell folks, be patient and wait for the honey locust to be available and for the better and better stuff to be available. Um, Grafting, top working in the field is you can do it, but it is a pain and it's a lot of work. Um, and we and others are making progress in having more and more quality and quantity of these honey locust trees available. Um, the improved seedling is those trees are going to have more genetic diversity, so it's valuable for breeding projects, for selection projects, where you can put out a whole bunch of trees. You don't necessarily would know what the qualities of each one are going to be, but if they're coming from good parents, chances are that some percentage of them will be as good or better than their parents, and then that can form the basis of for more breeding or cross selection or more propagation on your farm and other farms in your area. This is especially interesting for people who are kind of on the edges of where honey locusts typically thrive. There, it might be really interesting to go after seedlings and find trees that are adapted to your context. Grafting is the traditional way of clonally propagating honey locust. The main thing there, and it's a really good way, and we are doing a good bit of grafting as well. One thing to keep in mind is that the roots are going to have different genetics than the top. So if you graft it, the top has a certain genetics for female high yielding, and the roots are just a generic thornless honey locust. So there's two different ones, and if the graft were to die back to the roots, and it comes back from the roots, then you just have a generic seedling. It doesn't happen quite as often with honey locust as it does with, say, persimmons, but it is something to keep in mind, especially with what we call heavy metal disease, which is if you accidentally hit one with a tractor, it resprouts and it resprouts from the roots. You'll just have a seedling instead of a nice grafted tree. What we're working towards, and this will be hopefully in the next couple of years, is being able to provide folks with rootlings or tissue culture. So tissue culture is just a micropropagation technique that folks use in the horticulture industry, and it allows you to take one tree and turn it into thousands and thousands in the span of just a year. And then rootlings is another way of you're just taking a root off of a tree and growing another tree from it. Very, very simple, very old school method. But both of those, you get a complete clonal propagation where it's only like the whole tree is the same genetics, and that's what we're working towards. But we move at the pace of trees, so all of these things take a while. One of the things that I get asked every once in a while, and I spend a lot of time thinking about, is why we don't see more silvopasture. Right now, there's probably, I mean, less than 1% of farms in the US that could be planting trees in the pastures has done so, and I'm sure it's much, much less than even 1%. Um, and I like to think of it. I was reading a book on strategy here recently, and this highlighted it very nicely that this is kind of what the author called a chain link problem, meaning that you have a number of different chains or links in the chain, and each one needs to be there in order for this to work. And if any one of them, or especially if a couple of them are not present, it's really difficult to make this happen. So, if you have really, really nice nursery stock, but there's no one to help with consulting, there's no demonstration farms out there, there hasn't been any research, it doesn't really help because you need to have those other parts. Uh, Currently, or at least 5 years ago, when I started this, there was no silvopasture specific nursery stock. There was very, very few people who could do any consulting on this subject. There were almost no demonstration farms. Uh, there was research That was probably the lone bright spot, was that some universities had looked at this for years. But that was kind of the only thing. There wasn't funding, and there weren't great methods developed for establishing trees into pastures. And so a lot of these are things that we have developed over the last couple of years, particularly the nursery stock, the consulting. We have a whole suite of farms now that we've worked with, and those will then become the basis for more research. Now that they're established, now universities and their grad students can come and do research on those farms. We have much better methodology for establishing those trees, and the funding has also come along in the last couple of years. So I'm a big proponent of making this as simple as possible for folks who are otherwise too busy or too constrained to be able to get this done. Um, and I think I want to see a lot more people out there providing all of these services for folks. Because we found that there's a lot of farmers out there who really just want to see this happen. They want to do this on their own farm. But unless someone is out there to do it for them or to make it easier for them, it just doesn't tend to happen. Most farmers have way too many things on the to-do list in order to put the time, the money, and the effort into a long-term ROI thing like this. And many folks who have done silvopasture projects have seen pretty high failure rates. Folks who planted, let's say, 1,000 trees out in their pasture, and they only got 10 or 20% of them to survive. It's not uncommon. It's actually the rule rather than the exception among like DIY projects. And you just can't sustain that. It's not fun to do. It's not a good economic return if you get that low success rates and then probably slow growth as well. So we'll talk a little bit about why we've seen that from other folks. Um, when we start to think about a silvopasture plan, it's really important to think twice and plant once, right? This is a long-term commitment that you're making, so we want to make sure that we do it right. It's hard to move trees. It can be done, usually at a great expense, though. Uh, so there's a great quote by Warren Buffett that it's good to learn from your mistakes, but it's even better to learn from the mistakes of others. And that's why we put out this kind of information is we want you to be able to learn from our mistakes, learn from the stuff that we've done, so that you can go out and not have to make those mistakes as well. And you get much greater success right out of the gate, and you're able to see that success, and your neighbors are able to see that success, and we're able to move the practice of silvopasture forward. When we go to silvopasture, we have our own methodology. So Mark Shepard is the one who put out the term STUN, so strategic total utter neglect. And I said, I need to have my own little catchphrase. And so we're going to go with POGO. We might change this because it's not the greatest word, but we're going to go with POGO, meaning plant one, get one. That's really our methodology, and we try to go for that. That's our strategy, I'll say. Stun allows you to plant a lot of trees and not put nearly as much time or money into each one of them. With Pogo, you put more time, more energy into each one tree, with the goal of each tree surviving and thriving. So, like in this picture, each tree that we planted on this project was tagged. This is a grafted millwood honey locust. We're going to put a lot more money into that tree than a conservation grade seedling that you can buy for $1.50. We're going to put a tree shelter around there, and we're going to put a vole guard on there. So all these things that are adding up, we put a thick layer of mulch around that tree. So we're investing quite a bit in those trees, but we're planting a lot fewer per acre. And we are doing all of this because we want those trees to survive. We want 80, 90, 95% of those trees to survive. There's always going to be some mortality initially, but typically what we're seeing 90-ish% survival rates. So there's some downsides to it, but this is what has worked well for us and for our clients as well. And we've seen tremendous adoption of Silvopasture. We have I think we're about 50 or 60 clients that we've worked with, farms that we've worked with in the 2 hour radius around our place in just the last couple of years on Silvopasture projects. And that doesn't include all the folks that we've consulted with outside of that as well. Um, when we started, there were not well-developed methods for establishing trees into pastures without taking that land out of production. So being able to continue to graze those areas was not really an option for most in most cases. So this is a picture of what would you would call a fence out. So you build a fence on either side of the row of trees and you protect them that way. It can work. The downside though is you lose production inside of that area and you gain a chore maintaining that area, so keeping it weed whacked or mowed that nobody wants to do. So you're going to get competition then from weeds, from forages. You're going to create a great habitat for rodents as well. And it's just not a great way to protect low density tree plantings. It probably is the way to go for most high density plantings. If you're planting a lot of trees in a small space, you can't afford to individually protect them. It just doesn't make sense. That's where a fence out makes sense. But for low density plantings, this is not the best way to go. Cages, I was very, very excited when I saw these arbor shields on the market, probably 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I bought up a whole bunch of them and they're still laying around. I have not used them other than for messing around here or there on an experiment. They're hard to work with. They're heavy. They're expensive. With cages in general, trees they grow limbs through the cages. Then if you have to prune them, cattle will get up and because the leaves are coming through, the cattle will prune the leaves. They'll eat the leaves. Um, Grass will grow up inside of the cage and it's really hard to maintain. You can't really get to the tree itself. It's a great habitat for voles. Cages just don't have a whole lot going for them. I think if you were in a context where you needed to use a cage, I would probably go with a large cage, large enough that the cattle cannot reach the tree, and the tree also cannot easily grow out of the cage, and do a really, really heavy layer of mulch right around that tree, so that you don't have the weed pressure growing up inside of there. I'm talking like I want 6 inches deep of mulch and probably an area that's 5 feet wide or so. So those are the contexts where a cage can work. What we have developed, and this is our standard methodology now, is we run everything with a 6 foot tall planter tree tube. And Planter is a company that's based in Minnesota. They're good to work with. They have a 6 foot tall tree tube, and then it's a fiberglass stake that goes along with it. And the nice thing about those is that both are an electrical insulator, and so we can run our polywire along those. You can see on this picture on the left, this is just a single strand of polywire that's run along the row of trees, and that works, it doubles as a paddock division. And then on the right here, we're just running a single strand that's 6 feet high. So it's at the top of the tube. We're running a single strand, and then we are wrapping an aluminum wire. So you can see where we're tying in this aluminum wire, and we're wrapping that around the tube. And that way the whole tube is electrified, and livestock are still able to move freely underneath those rows of trees. So those are the main protection methods that we use. Again, starting with a 6 foot tall planter tree shelter if we're working with cattle. You can go smaller if you're working with sheep or goats, or if you just have deer to be concerned about. And then either running the polywire at the paddock division heights or at 6 feet tall so that livestock can freely move underneath them. Uh, you would be surprised that we lose fewer trees to cattle than we do to voles and other rodents. So I like to call this public enemy number one. You can see on that picture in the middle, a vole has completely girdled that whole thing. And it's kind of heartbreaking when you have a tree that's 8 feet tall and it's sticking out of the tube and it looks great, and then it just doesn't leaf out in the spring because a vole has gone through and chewed up the whole thing. So, because of that, we are very diligent about protecting our trees from voles. So on the right side, this is a vole protector, a vole guard that we use. It's just a spiral guard that we cut down to about 8, 9 inches tall, to prevent voles from getting to our trees. Here's another picture of a couple of the different ones that we've worked with. We started off using this one on the left, this kind of spiralized vinyl product. We've gone to using this one on the right because it has more ventilation and it wraps around the tree pretty nicely. And then we also add a vole deterrent, which is really just a mix of castor oil and blood meal. We haven't tested it. We haven't done any randomized trials, but it costs us a penny per tree. And if we're already out there doing maintenance, especially in those fall months as we're going into winter, it doesn't cost us hardly any money to drop a little bit of insurance down each tube and hope that it keeps the voles away. So we've made quite a few mistakes in our time with tree establishment. I want to share those with you so that you don't have to make those mistakes as well. One of those was using, instead of wood chips, which we really recommend, was using coconut coir mats. The nice thing about them is they're easy for project management. If you have 1,000 trees, you buy 1,000 mats and you just throw them out there. The trouble is that voles really like them because it's a nice solid cover over top of them, and they just go to town underneath those. And so it's inviting voles and other rodents in to be really close to your trees, which is a bad idea. So we don't do that anymore. We've done projects where we put wood chips down and not thinking about the fact that this farm has had pastured layers, and the layers they range around their little coops. And then they scratched away those mulch piles, and they loved it. They appreciated it very much, but you could not tell that we had ever put wood chip mulch around these trees. We used at one point, we tried using these open mesh tubes, and this is another Plantra product. We said, let's use those and see if we can get more airflow around the trees, especially like apple trees that don't like a lot of humidity. The problem is that trees will grow they'll grow their limbs, grow their twigs through those mesh openings, and then cattle will eat those leaves, and they seem to really like apple leaves, and they have a really good taste for those. And once they got a taste for that, then they would really, really push on those tree shelters to get more of those apple leaves. So we stopped using those, and we had to replace all of them with kind of our standard tree tubes instead. In the beginning, when all we could access was pretty small stock, we were planting trees that were 12 inches tall, 18 inches tall. We don't do that anymore. Anymore, we try to do stuff that's 3 foot tall at a minimum. And where we're going in the future is going taller and taller with our tree stock because we can take care of it so much better in the nursery than we can in the field. And we're going to get much better, more uniform results in the field if we start off with larger trees. And then also in the first year or two, I didn't really understand how much additional work it was going to be or how much follow-up it was going to be. Not that let's see if I have a slide. I guess I don't have a slide about that. It's not a lot of extra work, but it just needs to be done. It needs to be done on a schedule. You need to make sure that you're getting out there and looking at those trees, making small adjustments, small corrections so that they don't turn into bigger problems later down the road. Um, so, for folks who are interested in silvopasture and looking for a place to start, what I recommend to most folks is if you have trees already, woods on your property, start out with seeing what you have already going on there right on your own land, and figure out what you can do with those trees. This is a picture of this was a farm in Virginia where I was doing a consultation, and they had this whole area that was overgrown with autumn olives, and with honey locust, but they hadn't been able to identify these trees as honey locust. And we were walking around and said, well, you've got honey locust all over here. So how about we start out with thinning out some of these areas of autumn olives. Actually, some of the areas, this was a small sheep operation, and the autumn olives were great protection hedges where the sheep wanted to go anyway to get out of the wind, to get out of storms. To lamb in there, I said, you have a resource here, and it's free, and you're gonna spend a lot of time and money to get rid of these. So how about we use what we have already? So being able to make use of the resources that you already have is probably the best economic thing that you can do, and it's an easy low-hanging fruit, right? And then when you plant trees, it's really easy to start at the edges, at the fence rows, places that are already pretty well protected, and then get a hang of it before you start to do larger plantings. I also recommend the folks start with trees that are easy and cheap. So this black locust right here in the picture, that is at the end of year 3 that the picture was taken. Um, so you can see how much that tree has grown since we planted it, and we planted it as a probably 12-inch little seedling. The right species can grow really fast, and they can make you feel really good about your ability to grow trees. And if you can't grow a black locust or a hybrid willow or whatever cheap and easy and fast growing tree, you probably want to wait until you can figure those out before you get into something like a grafted persimmon that's going to be more expensive and more challenging to grow. Start out with those trees that are easy wins and then graduate on from those. And then I encourage people to, when you do your projects, your layout, keep it simple. Make sure that you can access your plantings very easily, and then plant in phases over time. This is a long-term thing. Those trees are going to be there a long time, so make sure that you do it right from the get-go. We only have a couple minutes left. Actually, we're over time. Let me just say that this is not just for tree huggers. This is for folks who are looking to make a profit as well. And I'd say primarily, Silvopasture is going to return you quite well. We have a return on investment estimator, like a calculator, at under our resources at treesforgraziers.com. If you want to get an estimate for how much return on investment you could see from a silvopasture planting, there's not a lot of data out there, but you can put in your own estimates, and we give you guidelines of what might be a good estimate for your context. So that's available at our website. Um, for mulberries in particular, I have whole articles on the website of how much return on investment you can expect, you can anticipate. We're working mostly off of older research and anecdotes from J. Russell Smith in the book Tree Crops, but there's a lot of anecdotal points to consider, and they give pretty significant return on investment, or pretty significant yield from these trees in our silvopasture systems. So go to the website, check that out. The basis of silvopasture, I think, is about creating more resilience. So I want farms out there to be resilient to too much heat and too much cold, too much rain and too little rain. I want folks to be insulated, to be buffered from high feed prices, high input prices that are happening out in the world around them. And they say, look, we've got our forages, we've got our perennials, we've got our livestock, and we've got our trees kind of protecting us and providing what we need in the seasons that we don't otherwise have our forages aren't otherwise doing well. That's what I want to see. I want to see grass farmers lower their cost and increase their incomes at the same time. And I think we can do that quite well with trees. It is a long-term investment, but it's very much worth the time and energy to do it, and it's only going to get better in the years ahead. So again, we have a lot of resources at our website, treesforgraziers.com. Check out the Grazier's Guide to Trees. That's the book on just the how-to on all of this. We have nursery stock. We're mostly sold out at this point of the season. We have tree shelters through our website. We have a lot of resources. And then we have an email list as well. If you want to learn more about what we're doing, if you want to find out about upcoming events and tree sales when they get to be live, that's the place to be, is on our email list. And with that, that wraps up my presentation part, and we can move over to the Q&A.
All right, that was great. Thanks, Austin. Let's just start with a couple of these questions that came in while we were here. Have your projects in the semi-arid Mountain West, have you had projects in the semi-arid Mountain West, and what species would you use?
We have not had projects out there. Really, our area of focus has been right around Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, so very, very different context. There like mesquite and honey locust are two species that come to mind. Mulberries could also come to mind. It really depends on your context, and where exactly you are.
Then Christina asked, what are your thoughts about combining the two paths, human food and
hmm
livestock support?
hmm Again, depends on the context. We recommend that folks plant trees for food crops around your home for your own homestead. I've got all kinds of nut trees and fruit trees planted for my own home use. That gives me greater resilience. I know that there's going to be trees producing all kinds of great staple crops for generations to come. Also, if you already have a market outlet, for your if you're going to a farmer's market, if you have a great way to retail what you have, you're in a great position to be able to also add to that. Say you're selling beef, let's also sell chestnuts, let's also sell hazelnuts. Let's do a chestnut roast and have people out to the farm in the fall. And then we're also doing an event where we're selling beef or whatever you have on the farm. So I think those are the contexts where those two fit in really well without having to do a lot of work to bet a lot on that tree crop, being able to harvest and process and market that efficiently.
Got it. Wendell asked, are some cherry tree leaves poisonous to cattle? He read in a historical newspaper about a drought in the South during the early
Mhm.
years of the 1900s, and the cattle ate small cherry tree leaves and died.
hmm So cherry trees are one of the few trees that I would recommend folks don't plant in their pastures because of that reason. Depending on what you read, just about every tree is toxic, but cherry trees are probably among the most toxic only if they're wilted. So fresh cherry leaves are fine. Completely dried up cherry leaves seem to be fine as well, but it's when they're wilted that I think it's cyanide that concentrates in those leaves, and can definitely cause mortality.
And how do you recommend a layperson learn how to determine which genetics are better when shopping online or at a nursery or store?
Mm, we have a resource on our website, uh, a nursery guide or nursery recommendations. That would be, I'd say, probably my first recommendations for people to look at. Take a look at my book. We do go into a little bit on trees, like tree genetics, and you'll want to understand the difference between a seedling and a grafted tree. That's a basic that you'll want to know. You'll want to know where they're sourcing their trees. Like there's a large difference too between a seedling that a nursery offers where they don't know where it came from, they don't know where the seed was sourced from, versus a controlled cross seedling or something that came from a specific orchard or a specific cultivar. In these silvopasture systems, it just makes more the it changes more. You have more riding on this economically to have really high quality trees out there. They're going to pay their way much better than a random tree that you can find from a nursery.
Then do you have any nursery recommendations that you have? Michael asked.
It really depends on what trees that we're talking about. We, I'll plug ourselves. In the coming years, we'll be providing a lot of mulberries in particular, for especially for pigs and poultry, but they also have really good leaf fodder. So mulberries is one that we're going to be pretty heavy on, as well as persimmon cultivars and honey locust, grafted honey locust to begin with until we can get more rootlings. And eventually, hopefully, tissue culture as well. And then we'll be providing like tall black locust, big hybrid poplars, big hybrid willows. Um, and then with if people need species recommendations for other species, there is that resource on our website.
Someone mentioned that mulberries tend to be very invasive, or is there a certain type that you're using to prevent that?
Not necessarily. We are working with trees that are bred for and selected for high yield and for high yield over a certain period of time. So one is like Illinois everbearing that drops over a long period of time. Um, and if you're in an area where mulberries can spread, I mean, it's probably going to happen. But that's it's something that we'll take for the significant upsides of mulberries. Some areas just they don't mulberries don't seem to spread. They've been in our country for 400 years or so. So I'm not too concerned about them. They're not going to take over anything, but you'll probably get stuff coming up on fence lines.
Yeah. And then Sue asked, what kind of soil testing are you doing prior to planting? Are you looking at the FB ratio and adjusting it to better suit the trees?
And in our area we have good soils for the most part, and we're also working with trees that are pretty low maintenance. Really, all of our trees that we work with primarily are they're pioneer species. So we don't do any soil testing because of the context that we're in. Our trees can just kind of take it. If you were to be working, let's say, with apples, or you're working with chestnuts, something that's a little bit more finicky, or with chestnuts, they want acidic soils that's well drained. Then you'll want to do more soil testing. But given the species and the context that we're in, we haven't found the need to be doing any soil testing other than taking a look at a map, like a soils map, and seeing just generally what we're working with.
Someone asked here, seeking recommendations for trees for goats and pigs in the Western Cascade foothills.
Goats and pigs are going to want very different types of trees. So your goats are browse-oriented ruminants. So they're going to take just about anything. And for goats, I would focus on trees and shrubs, like small, short-growing trees and shrubs that I can grow where I can keep the predominant amount of forages low so that they can access them. And thankfully, they can eat a whole wide variety of stuff. So, mulberries, black locust, willows. Oh, there's like alder would be an interesting one. There's a lot that could work well for goats, and then for pigs, you're looking at mulberries, persimmons, oaks, cascades. I'm not super familiar with that, with the rainfall patterns and that kind of thing for that area. Um, but you're looking for mast, right? You're looking for those tree crops, those fruits and nuts that will drop and make themselves available for pigs throughout the course of the year.
And Caleb asked, are there any US-based silvopastures using Paulownia?
Bologna,
He
yep.
can't Polonia, can't find much info on them around here, just in other countries.
Not much that I'm aware of. There probably are. And Polonia has been recommended and planted for quite a few years. I think mostly in pretty small plots. I've seen a couple plots of it. A couple of smaller projects, older ones. Um, it's an interesting one. Uh, I haven't really found any context where it's the one that I want to push very hard. It's
Yeah.
the aluminum of trees, or the aluminum of woods is the calling card. Apparently very light, but strong for the weight. Um, I've seen a lot of projects where the Paulownia was planted and it ended up not having good form because it was not managed the right way for the right form. I'm sure you can do it. It's fairly simple, but you got to keep up with it and you have to manage it the right way. So I've seen more projects that don't look all that great than I've seen success stories with Paulownia.
Juan asked, in the first picture you showed of a dairy, do you run the grazing management alley by alley or multiple alleys at a time? If you want to talk a little bit more about the management they use in that operation. Maybe go
Yeah,
back to that picture too.
yep, yep. So in that operation, we're doing that farmer is doing multiple rows of trees at a time. So you can see right here in that picture, those cattle have access to whatever it is, 6, 7 rows of trees because the poly wire is moving this way from left to right on the screen. So they have access to all of that. In that case, on this farm, they each tree is protected with barbed wire, which we have had poor success with on most other farms that we've tried it with, but this farm, their cattle seem to respect it quite well.
He also mentioned, and it's definitely something that I've dealt with our trees, is he would recommend throwing a wire vertically inside the tube to help minimize rodents. What type of rodent deterrent are you using with these
Hmm.
tubes?
So let's go back to that picture I showed earlier. So this is what we do. It's a combination. So we have those tree tubes, and the tree tubes, unfortunately, are not a rodent deterrent. They create a nice little covered area where rodents can go and hide. So that's why we put these vole guards around, and these are just pretty snug right around the base of the tree, and that prevents the rodents from being able to access the tree itself. And then what we'll put in is we'll put in that vole deterrent as well as a castor oil and blood meal. It's just stuff that we buy and we mix it up together. We throw it in there. That's just an added layer of insurance against voles.
And then I know you had just recently been down to Georgia. Someone asked, we
Mhm.
have a lot of wetlands, marshes, rolling hills, fields, and forests on our farm in Georgia. What trees do you recommend for this area? We hope to move away from the heavy cattle ranching to a blend of goats, hayfields, chickens, and greenhouses for native plant propagation.
Okay, that's a lot of information right there.
Yeah.
A lot of different
Well, I guess let's just talk
ecotypes
about
as
what.
well.
So why don't you explain to people? I don't know if you mentioned it all in this already, but you had went down to Will Harris's place, and
Mhm.
what type of trees did you guys establish there?
So the first trees that we established there were mulberries for their pigs primarily. The planting that we've done so far is I think we did 10 or 20 trees so far, just a very small planting to see if the protection methods that we use will work on their farm as well because they're farming at a whole other scale. They're about the size of 100 of the trees or 100 of the farms that we typically work with, and they move a lot of cattle through. So they have yet to test, they have yet to run their cattle through there. And if that works, then we'll do more planting. Surprisingly, there's a lot of trees that they grow in their area that grow in our area as well. So it's pretty much the same as your honey locust, your persimmons, your mulberries. They have a lot of pecans down there. For the most part, the species are very, very similar. They have a lot of pines down there. We haven't done a lot with pine establishment. They're not really all that interested in pine establishment either. For the most part, if they have an area that is in a pine monoculture when they take it over, then they're thinning it to create more forages underneath. So mostly we're looking at hardwoods that are going to be there a long term, and they're going to be dropping mast both for their cattle and for their hogs and poultry as well.
Yeah. Do you want to? That's really interesting. Do you want to talk a little bit about the connection you think with Jordan Green that you had at our conference? And Jordan talked a day before you, and he's talking about silvopastures with hogs.
Hmm.
I don't know if you guys have talked more since the conference, but what sort of combining your two methods do you see taking place? I know Jordan usually talks about taking old forest and kind of rejuvenating it, but what are you seeing some of the things that Jordan's talking about you find interesting with hogs? And I know you think highly of hogs on pasture too.
Yes, I do. I mean, there's just so much that I think we need to do, and we need to push forward on the hog side of things and being able to raise hogs on pasture well. I want to see so many of the hogs that are right now being raised in CAFOs, being raised in dirt lots. I want them to be able to move out onto the pasture, out into silvopasture. And what Jordan's doing is he's working within his context that is mostly forested. And that's going to be the case for a lot of people raising hogs outside, is that they're working with forests, they're working with woods, and they don't have open pastures. So he's working with those within that context to give those hogs a really great life, and also eat into his feed costs, reduce his feed costs by selecting the right trees that are masting trees. So your oaks and your hickories, your black walnuts. When he was there, he showed me black walnut syrup. He gave me a little sample of black walnut syrup, and actually, right now we're tapping black walnuts as well here. So that's a nice little income diversification that you can use with your woods. So I think if you're in a context where you're starting out with woods, um, that his specialty is his expertise on thinning that and how to use hogs for that is fantastic. If you're in an area where you have an open pasture and you want to be able to diversify your operation, you want to add hogs to that, then we're looking at adding trees into that pasture.
Yeah, on the black walnut topic, what are you seeing as the best forage options underneath black walnuts?
I wish I could answer that better. I don't have a great answer for which forages do well with that juglone. So black walnuts exude a chemical called juglone, and it reduces the vigor of certain species, certain plants. Like I think tomatoes, like don't plant tomatoes near a black walnut because they won't do well. A lot of your like vegetables won't do well. Um, I don't have a great sense of which forage species do well or do not do well under black walnut. If you wanted to look into that, I'd say Virginia Tech has done some work on studying forages under an open, like no shade, and under honey locust, silvopasture, and under a black walnut silvopasture. So that's where I would go to find out that answer.
And then can you speak about tree hay, or do you consider tree hay to
Hmm.
be an aspect of
Hmm.
silviculture at all?
Oh yeah.
Silvopastures.
So I would differentiate between tree hay, which is like tree fodder that I would set aside to feed during the winter, and like tree fodder where I'm just looking to either I'm pollarding, so I'm cutting the tree above browse height and I'm dropping that tree fodder for livestock to consume fresh, or I have an area where I have like a whole bunch of shrubs, a whole bunch of low growing trees, and I am protecting that. I'm keeping the cattle or the animals away from that. Um, and then until the time that I want them to access it, and then they can just go and browse it themselves. I don't have to go and cut down every stem for them. I think that there's considerable ways of using that. Um, I'll just highlight a couple. So sheep and goats are going to browse. They want to browse more heavily than cattle do, right? Like cattle primarily are going to be eating grass, uh, and goats in particular are going to want to browse more. So for a goat system, I would go heavy on the browse. I would want it to be machine coppiceable, so stuff that doesn't grow really big that you can still get through there with a brush hog, potentially with a forestry mulcher, and cut it all down mechanically so you don't have to go out there with your loppers and cut it all down to the ground. The other one that's particularly interesting, I want to see it researched, is the potential for tannins in something like a willow to be able to offset the negative effects of toxic fescue. So there's evidence out there that the tannins will bind with those alkaloids and make them basically neutralize them so that livestock don't experience the amount of heat stress that they typically do with toxic fescue.
That would be really interesting. Um, so I think that's all we'll be able to get through for questions right now. Our plan with Austin's workshop that he did at EcoAg in this year, I also included in the chat the link to that. And we're going to give you guys, since you're on the webinar here, 50% off on Austin's workshop, and then also just the general sessions to the EcoAg recordings. along with, because I think it goes well together, Austin's and Jordan Green's topics that they talk about. So Jordan's workshops in there as well. I would recommend you guys go into that. But Austin, where do you think, because our plan with this workshop is, it's kind of the base of the initial course that we're creating with you. What other things do you see us, being able to add to this over time?
Yeah. One of the things that I'd be very interested to do is something that's more homesteader oriented. I think silvopasture is one of those very interesting practices that scales up, but also scales down really, really nicely. Like if you're a homesteader and you're paying retail prices for everything that you're buying, right? You're paying retail prices for your hay, for your grains, all this stuff. Silvopasture fits in super well, and can give your family more resiliency, and can really reduce your costs a lot on that homestead level. So that's one that I would love to be able to develop and work out. And then the other one, and this is just going to take time, is being able to do a session that's more on pigs and poultry. But to do that well, I think we want to get some more of these projects out there. Right now, I can share historical documents like tree from coming out of tree crops, but I'm really excited for the time when we have actual hard evidence, current stuff that we can show. We're already working with folks like Rodale. We've done a silvopasture planting with them. We're sending trees to a couple different research entities out there so that they can get silvopasture established, so that we can get real results and data on how these are interacting with pigs and with poultry. So that's a longer term thing, but we'll get there over time.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate your time, Austin. Thank you for joining us again today. Everyone, again, we put a coupon code in the chat with the link. The code is trees for the number Graziers, and you get 50% off Austin's presentation and the general session recordings along with Jordan Green's workshop. See, someone doesn't see the link. Let me just repost it for you quick. But Austin will be around with Acres a lot more here in the future. We plan on hopefully having him back next year at the EcoA conference. And we appreciate all the work that you're doing. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Taylor. Appreciate it.
All right, Austin, have a great day.
You too. We'll see you.